this is just the beginning.
As Pride Month comes to a close, we're excited to present our virtual event, The State of LGBTQ Rights. I'm Ina Freed, Chief Technology Correspondent for Axios. I'm coming to you from San Francisco, California. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and of course, Axios.com. You can join the conversation today with @Axios and the hashtag Axios Events. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to take a look at where things stand with the Equality Act as it navigates Congress, as well as the wave of anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans bills specifically that have cropped up around the country. Our first guest is the representative for New York's 18th Congressional District, Representative Sean Patrick Maloney, joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Representative Maloney.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
So obviously the Equality Act has passed the House. It's awaiting action in the Senate. Help us understand, where are things with the Equality Act and why is it so important?
Well, the Equality Act, first of all, thank you for doing this, and it's great to be with you. And I know you're focusing on these issues as I do, and it's nice to know that at a place like Axios, which is such a top-flight organization, that it's getting this kind of attention. And so, look, the Equality Act is fundamental. It's employment non-discrimination. It's equality under all federal contexts in all sorts of different areas of civic life. It is the great unfinished piece of our fight for legal equality under the law. And unfortunately, I think some of us would have thought that this would have been an easier fight than some of the fights we've had before for, say, marriage equality or for adoption, hate crimes, all the difficult battles we fought and won as a community. But this is kind of their last stand, and it has so much to do with their fear mongering and an unwillingness to accept the transgender community in particular that is hanging it up. So we've actually had fewer Republican votes in this session than when we passed it last session. I'm proud of the Democratic Party for being 100% behind the Equality Act, but they're going the wrong way in the Republican caucus, and that's a problem. And it's going to be a fight to get it done, but we're not going to stop.
And when you say they, you're talking about Republicans broadly. And as you mentioned, that's interesting because in the past, bills similar to this have gotten significant amount of bipartisan support, obviously not anywhere near unanimous, but there was a time where you had significant Republican support. Do you think that the erosion of support is a change in opinions, or is it the fact, a symptom of the just general calcification of partisanship in DC?
Oh, no, it has nothing to do with partisanship. It has everything to do with hate. And it has everything to do with building a political business model around racism and discrimination against people, around saying incendiary things, about dividing people for political gain, trying to benefit from division and fear. We've seen enough of this in the Trump era to know what this business model is, and it's captured the Republican Party. Not every member, obviously, and not at every level of government, but here in Washington, in the Republican caucus, the fact is that Marjorie Taylor Greene is raising more money than pretty much anybody in that caucus. People like Matt Gaetz and people like Lauren Boebert, you know the list. They're driving the decision making in that caucus, and they are supported by the former president, and that is snuffing out any progress we could make in a bipartisan way on issues like the Equality Act. And it's awful to see, but it must deepen our conviction to fight for full equality for ourselves, for all marginalized communities, because increasingly we don't get the same support we used to from the other side of the aisle. Look at the Voting Rights Act, which was reauthorized with huge bipartisan support under the George W. Bush administration. Now it's the fight of our lives to try to get the Voting Rights Act restored to its full health. So unfortunately, I think it's a symptom of where the other party is moving on issues, particularly around race, LGBT equality, and other hot button, issues of that nature.
And what's happening in DC isn't happening in a vacuum. It's actually happening against a backdrop where we're seeing bills and laws in both directions around LGBTQ civil rights, but mostly bills attacking civil rights, particularly for transgender Americans. What can the government do absent the Equality Act's passage? What should the administration and others do against the backdrop of these laws that have been passed and in some cases signed into law?
Right. Well, I thank you for that question. I think it's really important because we can't do this doesn't mean we can't do anything. I have legislation called the Essential Data Act that would keep track in the CDC's National Crime Data Statistics, database, the level of violence against our community, which we know has reached epidemic proportions, particularly against transgender people of color. We don't track that data at the federal level, and you can't manage or improve what you don't measure. So that's one thing. We could stop conversion therapy from being funded with taxpayer dollars through the Medicaid program. I don't think people realize that conversion therapy is brutal practice of terrorizing gay kids and their families with this myth about curing or praying the gay away. That's actually paid for and reimbursed as a Medicaid service by a lot of states. We should ban that practice. I have legislation that would do that. And there's other things we can do that can test how much bipartisan support we can still garner, that leaves the door open. We always have to be open to expanding our coalition and welcoming people in. But let's be clear, the effort around religious liberty is in fact a wolf in sheep's clothing, in that it is an effort to carve out a higher level of permissible discrimination against our community than would be permitted against other protected communities under our civil rights framework. And what we've only asked for is the same protections, no more or no less, but to include LGBTQ people in the same framework with the same religious exemptions, by the way, that have applied in other contexts. But that has been unacceptable to the other side. So we must not allow a higher level of discrimination against our community than would be tolerated elsewhere.
And to be clear, this is often cast as religious people versus the LGBT community, when in fact there are obviously plenty of people in the LGBTQ community that are also people of faith. Aren't we actually, when we carve out these religious exemptions, preferencing certain religious expression over the civil rights of others, but also their religious expression?
Well, I think that, thank you for making that point, because of all the things that bother me about this, is this notion that one side is defending faith and the other side has a problem with it. We are people of faith. And particularly when it comes to raising children, that's an act of faith. It is a belief in this world and in this future. And it is often supported and made possible by a deep religious conviction of LGBTQ people. And we should never let them brand us as people without faith. But the point is that in areas like adoption, what you're really focusing on or should be focused on are getting kids into loving families and making sure that it is that interest of the children to be loved and cared for and raised by people who will protect them and see the best in them. That's what you're depriving so many kids of when you put in these restrictive laws. Because the truth is, our ability to cross lines of difference defines our community. And I don't think that these efforts are anything other than to limit the options for adoption agencies in terms of placing kids with loving parents on the basis of fear and discrimination and outright animus towards our community. And to dress that up as religious liberty is, I think, offensive to those of us who take very seriously our faith and also our commitment as parents.
And obviously, from whence you speak. You've raised 3 children and talked very poignantly about that during the Trump administration to your colleagues. Is it frustrating to have served and to be in Congress and feel like your civil liberties and those of communities that you align with are not fully accepted? And what do you think it has meant to have openly LGBT members of Congress? And why is that message still not getting through?
Well, look, let's not lose sight of how much progress we've made, right? We have traveled in a great distance in a short period of time, and the system is working for us because we have worked, because we've raised money and sat at the card tables and raised candidates. And yes, we're in the room and we've built straight allies. And it came at tremendous cost in the AIDS epidemic and in other periods, but we've made progress. But yes, it's frustrating that we're still fighting these fights. But I think of pioneers like John Lewis and others who faced discrimination and hatred, but who kept love in their hearts and who kept believing in progress. And that's what I'm going to do. And I've seen it in my own life. It's a beautiful thing when your country catches up to you, but we've all got to work for it.
Last question. What do you think the odds are that we get something like the equality passed in this Congress?
Well, it's 100%, but I can't tell you when. In this Congress, the Senate is a problem, but everyone should make their voices heard. They should hear us. And if they don't support it, then we need to elect some people who will.
Thank you, Representative Maloney.
Thank you so much.
Our next guest is the Executive Director of the National LGBTQ Task Force, Kierra Johnson, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Kierra.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be on with you, Ina.
So a lot of us might be sitting in Washington, D.C. or New York and San Francisco and reading about these bills, but not really having a full sense of the impact. What are you seeing? The LGBT Task Force is working on the ground in these states. You're seeing the impact that this legislation, particularly anti-trans bills at the state level, is happening. What are some of the things you're seeing?
Yeah, I don't think we've seen anything quite like this, at least not in recent history. I mean, it's, hundreds of anti-trans bills, and even more at the, targeted at the broader LGBTQ community. But there's just an overwhelming hostility and fervor around targeting young trans kids. It's happening, it looks different in different states. In some places, it's targeting access to healthcare. In other places, it is targeting kids' ability to use the bathroom or play sports. It is also in some places literally targeting what curriculum schools can teach. I mean, we are literally battling whether or not James Baldwin can be taught in schools right now. And so there is an all-out war to erase trans people, gender nonconforming people, queer people from history and from our today.
And speaking of erasing from the present, I mean, these bills have impact just in the words of their legislation. If trans kids can't play sports or access affirming healthcare, those in and of themselves are significant. But talk about what it means for a group of people to be excluded from sort of mainstream society, to be told they don't have a place in the places that they want to be, and talk about what the impact can be on trans youth, on their families, on their communities.
I appreciate that the question is about the impact on the youth, but also on the full community, because that really is what is at stake. This is a life and death situation for our children, right? We know what it means to affirm our children. We've seen the data. The data says, right, when young people have a loving person at home, when queer youth have an affirming place where they can fully be themselves, it is the difference between life and death. Over 40% of young people who identify as LGBTQ have attempted suicide, right? And so the impact of these anti-trans bills, it is literally telling these kids that they shouldn't exist. We're talking about 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. That doesn't get erased when a teacher tells you you shouldn't exist, when a legislator tells you you are not worthy of treatment in a healthcare center. And so depression, suicide, homelessness, again, over 40% of the young people on the streets today identify as queer. And let's not even talk about the epidemic levels of violence against trans women and trans women of color in our country today. We are literally on schedule for the most violent year in history against trans women and trans women of color in particular. And that's particularly hard to stomach in 2021, right? In the middle of our month of Pride.
And I do want to talk about that because there is a connection, right, between laws that attempt to further marginalize an already marginalized group and an epidemic of violence. And as you point out, it's not being broadly felt. It's being, the burden is on trans women of color who are disproportionately the victims of violence. Why is it that we get from, abstract laws that have specific impacts to the broader impacts to violence directed against trans women of color? Why are they bearing sort of the highest price for society's inequity?
Recently, a study came out from Cornell University that is kind of the talk of the town right now. And it is data that is supporting something that many of us have known for a long time, that queer people of color are experiencing higher levels of discrimination, higher levels of harassment and violence, and tension with law enforcement and the police than than LGBTQ people who do not identify as people of color. And specifically, we see higher levels of incarceration and violence and depression among Black and Latinx trans folks of color, or queer people of color. And we aren't disjointed people, right? Like, I show up in my Blackness, right? My womanness, my parentness, my queerness, my southernness every day of the week, every week of the year. And that means while I may bring a lot to bear, right, in contributions to our movement and to society, there is the burden of discrimination in this country that is targeting my Blackness, that is targeting my womanness, that is targeting my queerness. Those things don't happen in singular ways, but are compounded and are impacting the mental health of our families, of our friends, of our teachers, of our elected officials even. And we have to do our due diligence not only to fight back against the anti-trans bills that are happening on the state level. We've got to do the federal work too, and we've got to pass federal non-discrimination policies so that all of us are protected in our rainbow, if you will, but also all of us who identify as people of color, all of us, who are femme and who identify as women. These federal policies matter across the United States, and it's why it's so critical for us to get them passed now.
And we focused a lot, rightly, on the negative impacts that we're seeing from this. But one of the things that fascinates me is the degree to which we're also seeing people thriving. And it really feels like, Dickens is an odd choice for this conversation, but the best of times, the worst of times. When children have affirming communities and parents, even one person in their life, we're really seeing young queer people do incredible things. What is that flip side? What are we seeing when trans and other queer youth are allowed to fully participate in society?
Yeah, it feels so good to be at the White House, for example. I got to go to the White House for the first time as the executive director of the task force. And I watched this young trans kid speak from the platform with Secretary Buttigieg and the President of the United States. And he told his story, and he talked about his mother, and he talked about opportunities, and he talked about hope, and he talked about his friends. And then he gets off stage, and these other trans kids, everyone in the room is trying to meet the president, and they're trying to meet, members of Congress. The trans kids are like, I'm trying to meet Ashton. Like, it was so amazing. And that's what it's about. you have to see it to be it, right? You have to give children the opportunity to see themselves as wanted and needed. And they need to have role models who are in positions of power and who are actresses and who are creating policy change. And you see the effects of that. I mean, I'm a parent of 3, and 2 of my children regularly talk about their queer friends and their trans friends, and the dialogues that they're out and they're open and they're creating community. And when we create a space where all of our kids have a space, an opportunity to thrive, there's nothing but positivity that can come from that, right? We're creating creative spaces and creative solutions to old problems and new ones. Trans women are founding new organizations. Black lesbians and bisexual women are taking the reins of organizations that are 40, 50 years old in this movement, right? That offers so many opportunities for new ways forward.
Well, that's a great place. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much, Kierra Johnson, Executive Director of the National LGBTQ Task Force.
Thanks, Ina.
Our final guest is a GenderCool champion with the GenderCool Project, Stella Keating, joining us from Tacoma, Washington. Welcome, Stella.
Hi, thank you for having me. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks so much for taking part in this conversation. A lot of the world got to know you earlier this year when you testified before Congress around the Equality Act, but you've actually been speaking up, starting with a school board meeting when you were 9. What is it like to speak out and to speak up for your community?
It's really empowering, honestly. It feels really incredible. There was this one time that I testified on behalf of a bill that a senator was trying to pass in my state to create harassment, intimidation, and bullying policy specifically for transgender and non-binary youth in schools that would be required for school districts to enforce. And I testified in front of one of the House committees, and I was in a room with over 200 people who were against this bill, and it was really scary. But being there, I knew, and I told myself many times, like, they cannot stop me from being who I am. Them being there is not what's going to discourage me from being myself. And so it was really a powerful moment for me, and really why I love testifying.
And obviously it has a big impact to hear from the youth being impacted by these laws. Have you gotten to see people's minds change from some of your testimony?
Yeah, I have, for sure. I have had a coworker at work who, she kind of changed her mind about transgender people, and we had an incredible conversation about it. And it was an incredible thing because I knew when we had that conversation, I just knew that my work, the work that I'm doing, was actually working, which was really exciting to see that in action. It was really cool.
A lot of the bills that are around the country, and we should point out, Washington has actually expanded protections for LGBTQ people during the time that a lot of states have curtailed rights. But a lot of the bills are centered around 2 specific areas that have become hot button issues: youth playing sports and access to affirming healthcare. What does it mean for you and your peers and trans kids around the country to have access to affirming healthcare? Why is that so important?
I think that for a lot of youth, it's what, it's affirming for them. It's really, I have this one part of me that's like my outside world, and then I have my inside world. And by having affirming healthcare, I can match the outside world with my inside world as best as I possibly can. And that means that I get to be more authentically myself. I still remember so clearly the day that I started estrogen. That was an incredible moment for me. And I was so incredibly excited because it's been something that I wanted to start for so long. And it was really exciting. And having affirming healthcare, again, is just, it allows me to be more of myself and allows me to be the person who I want to be every day.
And for some people, and that may or may not be you, part of being who they are is playing on a sports team. And that's become a real hot button issue. And I think a lot of people imagine like all these Olympic athletes in training, and that's not really what we're talking about most of the time. What role can sports play in the lives of trans youth and non-trans youth to learn about their trans and non-binary classmates?
Yeah, I think I was interested in starting a sport actually at the beginning of my sophomore year. And I only wanted to start that sport and be in that sport because I wanted to just hang out with my friends. Like that was it. I just wanted to be around people who I loved and that I wanted to hang out with. And that was going to be the place that I could do that. Of course, I didn't end up doing it because, a global pandemic. And so, I think that for a lot of trans youth, it's really all about just getting to be with friends.
And of course, the bills may be targeted at trans participation in sports or access to facilities or access to healthcare, but the impact is actually much broader. What impact does it have when a state says you can't take part in something because of your gender identity? And not just for you and the folks that have supportive families, but also for folks that are struggling, that don't have the kind of support that you've enjoyed.
Yeah, I think that I may not be a sporty person, but having a state and a legislative body that tells me that I'm not allowed to do something sucks. Like that just feels bad and tells me that I am, not allowed to be myself. It really is kind of suppressive, which is really disappointing, because being yourself is incredible and it's an incredible opportunity that you have as well. And, it's a real disappointment seeing those kinds of things and seeing what these people don't want me to do and what they don't want me to have the opportunity to do.
And you've mentioned that you actually get a lot from the political activism you do. You want to be a politician when you grow up. Do you ever get frustrated, though, that you have to speak out, that you, not just you personally, but that you're constantly having to speak up for why you should have the right to be treated just like any other kid?
It's frustrating that I still have to do it, but I also really enjoy it and love it because, the story that I share and how I share it, it shows people that I am just like every other teenager. I'm completely normal and I am no different from your own child if you have one. And I think that that's what's so incredible and what keeps me going because, again, I see in action like people's hearts and minds changing because they get to meet me. And so I've found that I get less and less frustrated that I still have to do this work.
Obviously, I don't think you have a magic wand, but if you did, what would you have people understand? What do you wish more people understood about not just your experience, but your peers and those who you've had an opportunity to meet and work with through GenderCool?
I wish that a lot more people just understood that, again, I'm just like every other kid. I'm just a completely normal person, and that's really important to understand because it creates a more loving and accepting environment and a more loving and accepting world. And if I did have a magic wand, I would wish that everyone, understood that transgender people are normal people.
And in terms of the Equality Act and what would it mean to have protection around the country? I've seen these stories of families with trans youth thinking of having to move from their state. Why is it so important for us to have a national law that protects LGBTQ civil rights equally across the country?
It's really important because right now, I'm a rising junior right now, and I'm going to be looking at colleges pretty soon, and there might be a college that's absolutely perfect for me, but I won't be protected. I could be denied just basic housing needs. I could be denied living in an apartment because I'm transgender. And that's, the Equality Act gives me the opportunity to just live a more normal life and to be more free and to be more myself. And that's, I think, having the Equality Act, I think that is why it's so important that we pass the Equality Act.
I think we're going to give you the last word. Thank you so much, Stella Keating, joining us from Tacoma, Washington.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that I hope has made us all smarter, faster. For more information or to sign up for my daily newsletter, Axios Login, or any of our newsletters, you can go to getlogin.axios.com or on the Axios app. And thank you all for joining, and we'll see you at axios.com.